Guess what? This is one of our winter shorts. Yep, that's right. It's a shorter than usual episode in which I present one or two, or maybe three or four classic evergreen segments from previous episodes that is remastered, reconstituted, and recycled for your listening and learning pleasure. But mainly it's to give me a break for self-care over the holiday season. We'll be back to our regular programming in late January.
Welcome to the A&P Professor, a few minutes to focus on teaching human anatomy and physiology with a veteran educator and teaching mentor, your host, Kevin Patton.
In this episode, I explain why I think storytelling is the heart of effective teaching. And then I tell the Actin-Myosin love story. Over the decades, I've come to appreciate the idea that good teaching involves storytelling. That teaching is a kind of storytelling. And I firmly believe that if we think of it as storytelling, if we acknowledge the fact that teaching is storytelling, our teaching becomes more effective. And what do I mean by storytelling in the context of teaching? Well, there's a wide spectrum of things that we do when we interact with our students in a course in ways that facilitate their learning. There are, of course, lectures and mini lectures and online lectures and discussions we lead and so on that are obvious opportunities for storytelling, telling the story of how the human body is built and how the human body functions. But when we approach our entire course as an opportunity for storytelling, it gets even better. It's sort of like a filmmaker or an amusement park designer, amusement ride designer, who thinks of it as telling a story. And so there's a beginning, a middle, and end. And if we think of that as a beginning, a middle, and an end, and take those things that we know about teaching and learning, such as learning outcomes that we expect, the place that we're kind of starting from, like what do we want the student to learn, and then how are we going to get there, and then how are we going to wrap it up at the end and conclude and pull all those threads together. We can do that when we're physically telling a story in the classroom, let's say in a lecture context, but we can also do that in the entire course design and the design of each component of that course. If we think of it as a story, then I think that it works better in our own minds, and therefore it translates better for the student. And once the student starts thinking of these as stories, and my students, I use that terminology with them. I'll say, remember when I told you the story of how the nephron works? And they start getting that mindset of these are stories, and that makes it more accessible to them, I think, than when they think of it as the lecture on the nephron. If it's the story about the nephron, wow, suddenly it takes on a whole different flavor than it did before. And it's not just using that terminology in presenting things the same way we've always presented them. I think it's important for us to think of them as a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and with protagonists and antagonists and good guys and bad guys and amazing things that happen. And I think that where that starts is to understand that we are walking in the classroom and taking on the persona of a storyteller. So it's a kind of acting. And if you've ever heard professional storytellers or even amateur storytellers, I think you can kind of see the transformation that comes over people, especially if you have a friend or a family member or something that likes to tell stories. Sometimes their affect will change just a little bit, maybe a lot, when they get ready to tell some favorite story of theirs, especially if they're talking to children, but even when they're talking to adults and telling a story to adults. And I think a lot of us as teachers do that. And I think that's a great thing. It's a good thing to have that storytelling persona, that teacher persona that we walk in with, especially for those of us that are introverts. I think that if we think of, walking into a classroom and we're naturally very shy in front of crowds and so on, but we think of it as an acting role that we have and we walk in, then it puts us and our students at much more ease, because now it's not Kevin, the teacher anymore. It's Kevin, the storyteller. And I'm going to come in and tell you some stories. And I'm an actor for that time that I'm spending with you. So that acting part is important. One aspect of that is that people usually want their storytellers to be living the story with them, sort of as if the storyteller is hearing the story for the first time as well. Most storytellers do not speak in a monotone and just kind of rattle off the events of the story. They get somewhat dramatic. They move their arms a little bit. They move around a little bit. They act out certain parts. They change their voice at certain parts. And I think that if we do that, and not only that, but have fun doing it. I'll never forget, and I've mentioned before in this podcast that I used to be a lion tamer in the circus. And I spent a lot of years learning how to do that and going to circuses and watching other animal trainers and other circus performers and so on. And my mentors pointed this out to me, that you always go in and act like you're having fun. And if you act like you're having fun, then everyone around you will have fun. And then pretty soon, even if you weren't, you are now having fun. And psychologists tell us that that happens. They often use a technique to help people who are having a hard time having fun or having a hard time smiling or being happy, is to, just smile a lot and you'll feel better. And maybe there's some physiological things that go along with that. My point being that if we walk into our classroom and consciously think about the fact that we're taking on a new persona, a persona who's going to have fun telling a great story. And then the next step is that most people in our classes, or most people who want to hear a story, have curiosity about certain things. And I think that our students have a natural curiosity about the human body. My theory is that everybody who lives in a human body has some level of curiosity about how the body is built and how it works. But I think our students in particular come in with that because they've been drawn to a career path that involves the human body. So they already have that curiosity. So we can start out with, did you ever wonder how the kidney does what it does? What does the kidney do? You got any ideas? And then move from there into, let me tell you about the nephron. The story of the nephron is an amazing story. It's the weirdest things that happen and the most unexpected things that happen. But at the end, we end up reaching our goal of maintaining homeostasis. And so, telling it as a story and having characters in that story, identifying the characters in that story, the different segments of the nephron tubule, for example, could be characters, or the ions and other molecules that are moving, glucose and so on, that are moving back and forth across the wall of the nephron. Those could be characters in our play. We have a lot of recurring characters in our stories, don't we? I often will say that. It's like, here's calcium again. Here's, our recurring character has come back in for another episode of A&P. Having that story perspective is important. Having a beginning, middle, and end is important. I think if we can introduce some conflict and resolution, that'll help. Talking about the nephron, we can talk about how, if a negative ion is pulled across the membrane, what are the positive ions going to do? We're going to have this electrical charge building up. Is that something that we want to continue? Are we going to allow the positive ions to follow the negative ions, or vice versa? Are we going to pull these ions across and let the water just stay there? Are we going to have an osmotic imbalance? Or are we going to let the water come across too? So we set up conflict, we identify conflict, and then we say, how is that resolved? How do things naturally occur? And a lot of times, the audience of the story, our students, they kind of know how it's going to go. Don't you have that experience when you're listening or watching stories? I know in movies, sometimes I'll feel like I'm getting to know a character and I can predict what they're going to do next, or especially in miniseries and television series and things like that, where you'll start to be able in your own mind predict, how a character is going to react. And I think if we set that up for our students, they can start to do that too. They can sort of tell what's going to happen when there's an electrical imbalance across a membrane, or an osmotic imbalance across a membrane, or any one of a number of other kinds of conflicts that they've seen resolved in other areas of the body. And when they do that, they're just not being good listeners to the story. They're starting to get to those higher levels, or maybe I should say deeper levels of understanding of how the human body works. And so they are just naturally being drawn to higher level thinking skills, to higher level understandings of what we want them to understand. I think another aspect of storytelling that can be very effective is when there's some shock and awe involved. And what I mean by that is like, oh my gosh, how can this happen? How can this happen in the body? How, is this really what we're going to do? If we think about all of the fluid that is filtered out of the glomeruli into the nephron, and we think, oh my gosh, you add all that up, that's gallons and gallons and gallons of water we're going to end up lost from the body. That's shocking. That is awesome. And then we resolve that. We say, well, wait a minute. That's, do we really pee 50 gallons a day? I don't think so. So something's got to happen. What could possibly happen before that fluid gets out of our body that can restore the balance and prevent us from drying out almost instantly? And so if we are bringing that shock to the fore, if we're dramatizing that and bringing it out, and not only that, but acting shocked ourselves. Don't good storytellers do that? Don't they act surprised even though they've practiced this story a million times and probably have told it 1,000 times? But they do. They act out. They dramatize that shock. And I do that with my students. Like, oh my gosh, how can we do that? And they know that I'm not being totally sincere. They know that I know the end of the story and what's going to happen. But it helps to tell the story, and it helps them hear the story. I'll never forget a ringmaster announcer in a circus that I saw several times. He's French, and even though I did see him in the United States, I also saw him over in Europe. And he's one of the best ringmasters I ever saw, even though I only understood about half of what he talked about because he usually spoke in French. I mean, he did do a little bit of English, especially when he toured in the United States, but he mostly announced the various circus acts in French. And he was so good. You don't think of the ringmaster as being one of the stars of the show, but he was always one of the stars of the show in whatever circus he appeared in. And the reason is that he became the storyteller. And he would not just announce an act, he would stay around and he would watch. And you could see him act out the shock and the awe when a high wire artist was going across and maybe was teetering a little bit. And you would see him and his face would change. And he would appear to be just as shocked as the rest of us. And he would laugh when there was a comedy circus act on, like maybe Comedy Acrobats or something like that. And he would act out in a very dramatic way. He would act out his reactions. And what that did was get us as the audience more involved in the circus act that we were seeing at that moment. And that's the kind of teacher I want to be. I want to be just like that ringmaster. I want to be expressing that shock and that awe and that amazement of the human body to maintain homeostasis under a wide variety of conditions. And even when bad things happen, can recover from it if things are happening normally. And we can be shocked and saddened when things get broken, when the heart valves don't work right, or when the kidney doesn't maintain homeostasis consistently in terms of our fluid and electrolyte balance. And one last thing that I'll mention, there are many other things about storytelling, but one last thing is to use a lot of pictures, don't use a lot of words. So I think anatomy and physiology, both ends of that, the anatomy part, the physiology part, lend themselves to visual storytelling, where we show a picture and walk our audience, our storytelling audience, through that part of the story. And then we change the scenery and we walk them through that part of the story. Putting up 25 bullet points in one slide is not going to help storytelling. What we should do is use a title, maybe one or two little bullet points, especially if there's subtitles of that story, to help the students understand sort of where we're going in that story. It's sort of like when you go to the theater and you look at the program. What you will see is a very, very short outline. It'll have Act 1, Act 2. It'll list the scenes and tell you some short little thing about each scene. maybe it just tells you where it occurs or what major thing happens or could be happening in that scene. If we're going to be using slides or other visual aids, make them mostly pictures and make them be very few words. I think you'll tell a much more effective story. Your students will be listening to your story rather than trying to read the slide and copy it down if we do it that way. So a few storytelling tips for your next A&P class. Have fun with it. I know. Nobody is eager for a sponsor message. But not only do federal regulations require it, believe it or not, our sponsors expect it. And they're financially supporting this podcast so that there's no cost to you. Yay! Besides that, I'd be mentioning them from time to time anyway, because all three are great organizations that I'm intimately involved with, and they benefit all faculty teaching anatomy and physiology. Can I say that? That I'm intimately involved? I hope that's okay. One of our sponsors is AAA, the American Association for Anatomy. Check out all the resources and membership information at anatomy.org. Another sponsor is the Master of Science in Human Anatomy and Physiology Instruction, the HAPI degree. Check out this online graduate program at Northeast College of Health Sciences at northeastcollege.edu/HAPI, that's HAPI. And rounding out our sponsor list is HAPS, the Human Anatomy and Physiology Society. You can check out resources and membership information online at theapprofessor.org/HAPS, that's HAPS. In a past episode, I talked about how storytelling is important in teaching in general and in teaching human anatomy and physiology in particular. And that led to a discussion about how being playful and serious at the same time really works well. And coming out of that discussion was the idea that playful analogies can be very helpful. And of course, with analogies, they're never really 100% true to the concept that the analogy or the model is trying to represent, but they sometimes help the little gears inside our brain to connect with the reality of the concept. So keeping that all in mind, I want to, as promised in a past episode, share with you one of the analogies, one of the little stories that I tell, and it's kind of playful and fun, but it's also very serious. Before I get into this story, which is a shortened version of the story, we don't have time for a mini-series here. It's a version that I put into a little booklet that I created a while back called The Survival Guide for Anatomy and Physiology. It's just a handy little helper for students who are struggling in A&P, and it's got a number of analogies in it, and this is one of them. So keep in mind, it's an abbreviated version of the story I tell, and you can imagine how it can be expanded to include some other details of the concept that I'm going to be getting into in a moment. And the concept is the process of muscle contraction and relaxation. What's happening at the molecular level within the muscle fiber. So I kind of often call it the muscle love story. It's more or less loosely based on the idea of Romeo and Juliet and other kinds of, old classic love stories. And so it does have some traditional gender roles in it, so be forewarned because of it being built on these old classic love stories. And before I get into it, I just want to mention also that there are previous stories that I've told in my class that get the students ready for this. Particularly, I put a big emphasis on the cytoskeleton when we're discussing the cell early in the course. I know for a long time I just kind of skipped over the cytoskeleton, but I've realized that it's really an important character in many of the stories of the body. And of course, science in general has been realizing that, and we're starting to learn more and more about the cytoskeleton and how the components of the cytoskeleton and how they function really are central to understanding a lot of the basic principles of A&P. One of the things I do when I'm discussing the cytoskeleton is bring up the idea of motor molecules. And I even mention myosin and kind of look at it just in a very simplified way, how motor molecules work, and tell them that there's going to be this later story where myosin is going to be a major character, and it's going to be, interacting with an actin filament, and it's going to be doing this motor molecule thing. And that's how muscles contract. And I'll leave the details of the story till later. Well, now it's later. Here we are, back to the future. First thing we have to do is set the scene for the story and introduce the characters. And before I do all that and really start the story, I've already described for my students the typical muscle fiber. And more importantly, the myofilaments and the sarcoplasmic reticulum, or SR, and what it does, and the T-tubules and where they're at and what their characteristics are, and all the important parts. Their structures and their physical relationships to one another. So they have all that down, and their heads are spinning, and they're trying to figure out what's going on. So now's a good time for a brain break, right? We can sort of step away from that and play for a little bit. And so I put even more drama into my voice and start moving around a little bit more to tell this story. And so once upon a time in the land of the muscle fiber, several interesting characters live. Myosin is in love with the girl next door. Her name is Actin. The problem is, as it often is in these love stories, the problem is that some of the villagers want to keep myosin and actin apart. Young lovers are never a likely match according to the other people around them, are they? There's a group of women there too. Each of them is called troponin, or troponin if you prefer. And they constantly try to keep myosin getting to his true love actin by holding up poles made of tropomyosin. These tropomyosin poles could be easily knocked out of the way by the brave and strong myosin, but all those troponin girls are very strong too, and they keep the tropomyosin in its blocking position. Every good love story needs tension like that, something keeping the lovers apart. In addition, there's a good subplot. Turns out, troponin girls are in love too. They all pine away for their true loves, all of whom are named calcium. The problem for them is worse than for actin and myosin. All of the calciums are under guard in the SR, the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The SR, as it turns out, happens to be a sort of prison yard on the banks of the rivers which travel through the village, and those villagers call them T-tubules. Given their situation, it's very unlikely that any of the troponins will ever be visited by a distant calcium imprisoned in the SR. Poor things. However, one day an odd thing happens, as it always does in these stories. A stranger, of course, it's a stranger. There's always a stranger. A stranger called acetylcholine is sent by the governing nervous system. Acetylcholine, or ACH to his friends, hits the sarcolemma, which is the wall around the village. And that launches a traveling voltage fluctuation. Now, you and I would call it an action potential, but the villagers think of it as a lightning strike. Well, that voltage travels right along the sarcolemma. When it gets to each of the T-tubules, it travels right down the T-tubules and thus crisscrosses the village. As it travels down each T-tubule, the voltage zaps the SR, which sure does startle the guards. The guards are so stunned that they let many of the calciums escape and run all over the village. Oh my. The troponins, of course, can hardly believe it. They dreamt last night that they were surrounded by calciums, and lo, it has happened. The calciums and the troponins embrace. In the heat of passion, they twist around a little bit, and the troponins completely forget about holding up the tropomyosin poles. Well, that gives myosin the chance he and actin have been waiting for. He moves across the barrier, and myosin and actin immediately start, getting passionate with each other. Myosin is very excited and just keeps actin moving along. I'd get into sliding filaments here, but it's a family show, okay? You get the picture. We have contraction because actin is being actively pulled along by myosin, who's using a lot of energy. In the meantime, back at the SR, the guards have recovered and now rounding up the calciums and taking them back to the SR where they belong. As each troponin tearfully bids her calcium goodbye, she realizes that she was not paying attention to her job, and so she gets back to it. The next time myosin is ready to cross over to actin, he can't. He's again blocked by those tropomyosin poles. And they're being held in place by the troponins, because they're back on their job, remember? Thus, the little village returns to its relaxed state, if you can call it that. It's just a matter of time until it all happens again. All of the old attractions are still there, and someday acetylcholine, or ACH as his friends call him, will ride into town and stir up another electrical storm. So that's the end of that chapter of the story. But I keep coming back to that story as we start to add layers of information onto that. For example, I always take the opportunity of discussing muscle contraction to bring into the consciousness of my students the idea of metabolism, particularly how the myosin gets the energy. The myosin, of course, gets energy from ATP, but where does ATP get the energy? Well, the ATP, those are like little batteries. Those are recharged in the mitochondria. And so where is that energy coming from that those ATPs can be recharged? Mostly in the mitochondria, not entirely, but mostly in the mitochondria. Well, ultimately that comes from glucose. And so we can talk about that whole process and bring that into, well, why do we need to know about metabolism? Why do we need to know about ATP? Why do we need to know how glucose breaks down and releases energy and that's transferred to ATP? Why in the world do I need to know about oxidative phosphorylation? I'm only going to be a nurse, as if only is appropriate when talking about any of the health professions. The idea being like, you're trying to teach me too much, but now they can see that, well, it all fits into the story. There's a lot of interaction here. There's drama, and who can't relate to a good dramatic story? So, you might already be using some kind of a story like this, and this might give you some other ideas to maybe change up your story a little bit or add to or take away. You might have a different story, and if so, I'd really love to hear it, and I'm sure our other listeners would. So call into the podcast hotline, and I hope you all live happily ever after. If you don't see links in your podcast player, go to the show notes at the episode page listed at theapprofessor.org/podcast. And while you're there, you can claim your digital credential for listening to this episode. And you're always encouraged to call in with your questions, comments, and ideas at the podcast hotline. That's 1-833-LION-DEN or 1-833-546-6336, or send a recording or written message to podcast@theapprofessor.org. We'll pivot back to fresh, full episodes in late January when I'll be giving my predictions for next year. If you have a prediction for where A&P instruction is headed, please send it in. I'll see you down the road.
The A&P Professor is hosted by Dr. Kevin Patton, an award-winning professor and textbook author in human anatomy and physiology.
This episode has been reconstituted from concentrate using only 100% pure electrons from a natural spring.